It's a pretty fair guess that Georgia is going to end up being the most watched college football team this year because it's in a few of the biggest games of the college football season. At Bama, at Ole Miss, and of course at Texas. And that Georgia-Texas game, I think, could be the biggest game of the year. It totally could end up being the most watched game of the year. I think that there are storylines beyond just the fact that there are probably two of the top 3 or 4 teams in college football this season. You look at it, you look at the predicted rankings, you look at the projections, and yeah, Texas is probably somewhere in that 3 to 6 range as far as as far as the ranking, and Georgia's 1 or 2. And when Georgia goes and plays in Austin on October 19th, about midway through the season, it's going to be a big deal. There's going to be a lot going on that weekend, but I think that there are a few storylines in that game that I want to go ahead and start talking about because I think it's deeper than just, hey, Texas is in the SEC now. Georgia, this is their biggest test of the regular season. I think it's deeper than all that. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about Georgia, Texas, and why I think this game, already huge, but it's probably bigger than people realize. A few talking points I want to get to with it. You know what? I'll start with the quarterbacks. Possibly the 2 best quarterbacks in college football. Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, right? Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, both top 3 in Heisman odds. Dylan Gabriel of Oregon, an older guy, is another name you have to throw in there. Obviously, some people favor Shedeur Sanders. I think that across college football, there are a lot of good quarterbacks. Jackson Dart's a very good quarterback. I think LSU's Garrett Nussmeier is going to have a pretty good season. Jalen Milroe, obviously. I could throw out a bunch of names. KJ Jefferson, a guy that people used to talk about. Is he have a bounce-back year at UCF? Does Jackson Arnold have a really good year? Is blanking on the USC quarterback's name, but I think the guy that's going to replace Caleb is going to be really good. But at the top, it's Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, at least for guys that are considered pro-style quarterbacks. They're not necessarily dual threats. And they're going to Duel. And that's going to be a big game for NFL scouts. Pressure, big moments. Part of the reason why they have such good chances to win the Heisman Trophy is because they're going to be in those big moments. Georgia, obviously. Carson Beck and the Dogs, they're going to play at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. First game is against Clemson and Mercedes-Benz Stadium. That's going to be a pretty big game, a pretty watched game, even if I think it's not going to be a close one. You've got the 3 rivalry games. The hometown game for Carson Beck in Jacksonville against Florida, Georgia Tech, Auburn. So there's just going to be a ton of moments, especially for Georgia and especially for Carson Beck in terms of that, and why I say I think it's going to end up being the most watched team in college football this season. For Texas, it goes the same way. It's their first year in the SEC. They got to play Michigan. They got to play Georgia. They still got to deal with Oklahoma. I got their schedule pulled up. They've got Arkansas, Kentucky, Texas A&M. Not quite as difficult of an SEC schedule as the Dogs and some other teams in the conference, but still, it's going to be a high-powered offense. It's got Steve Sarkisian, and these are 2 quarterbacks. They're first-round projected picks. Quinn Ewers, not as much as Carson Beck. Carson Beck is currently the leader in the clubhouse to be the first overall pick, at least to be the first quarterback off the board in the 2025 NFL Draft. But these are one of those games where, hey, Texas plays better. Quinn Ewers just flat out looks better. Scouts are going to go back to that and watch that. Now, a good scout's not going to base their entire opinion about these quarterbacks off of one matchup and off of one showdown, but it's going to matter because they're both unloaded teams. Texas is going to be the home team. Georgia's a little bit better of a team, so it levels out a little bit, right? And you know how these home crowds, and now Texas is an SEC crowd. We know it's one of the better crowds in college football. We've seen Beck be able to do it on the big stage in big moments. Auburn, South Carolina last year. We've seen Quinn Ewers help beat Alabama last year, help win the Big 12, help almost beat Washington, right? Very good semifinal game against another NFL quarterback in Michael Penix Jr. and NFL receivers on that Washington Huskies team that was coached by Kalen DeBoer. Texas got battle-tested in 2023 for sure. And for the most part, they passed that test of, are you ready to be in the SEC? And the way that the national media has covered Texas and what we know about Texas, it seems like they passed that test, right? Well, that kind of transitions into my next point, which is this is the real welcome to the SEC for Texas, because I look at Texas's schedule. versus Colorado State at home, whatever. At Michigan, tough game, tough road game, not an SEC game. Versus UTSA, versus Louisiana Monroe at home. They get a little bit of a warm-up there in September. Their September's not as tough as Georgia's or as a lot of other schools. Versus Mississippi State is their first SEC game of the year. Guess what, man? That's in Austin. That shouldn't be a close game. All right, unless Mississippi State pulls out some tricks out of its hat that I don't know about this coming season, that's not going to be a close one. Then you get Oklahoma, technically an SEC game now, but that's not your welcome to the SEC moment. Their first, hey, you're playing one of the big dogs, and it happens to be the Dogs, is against Georgia October 19th. That is Texas's real welcome to the conference after they've been integrated into it, after they've already played a game. It's huge. It's going to be a big game, and it's why the eyeballs are going to be on it. It's one of the times on Georgia's schedule that hasn't been announced yet. If it's before 3:30, I'd be shocked. I'm leaning towards this ending up being a night game, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does end up being that late afternoon, and I don't think there are any real... Are we really going to complain if it's a 3:30 kick? That's still going to be awesome. So, for Texas, this is big because now people can make too much out of it if Georgia goes in there and beats them by 2 touchdowns or whatever. People can make too much out of it in terms of, oh, Texas isn't ready. Well, Georgia's probably the best team in college football, so it could mean a couple of different things, but on the other hand, it's a big test for Georgia. How are you going to handle this? You've already had a couple big road trips against Kentucky and Alabama at that point in the season, had to deal with Clemson, and then you got to go on the road to play Texas. It's going to tell us a lot about how, look, we're going to know how good this Georgia team is pretty early. I think that 2023, especially with the way the schedule broke down and just a lot of the transitional things that Georgia had to deal with, quarterback, coordinator, a lot of just turnover, it took us a while to learn how good Georgia was in 2023. And by the midway through it, we knew that they were championship contenders, but with the asterisk that they weren't quite as strong as the previous 2 squads that did go on to win the trophy. That's what we learned about Georgia. We're going to learn more about them more quickly because of the difficult schedule early on. For Texas, I don't think that you can say the same thing. So for Texas, it's a bigger test for them. For Georgia, we're going to have a good idea. Hey, look, this is how Georgia did against Alabama. This is how they did against Kentucky, Clemson. This is the expectation. I don't think you can have as high expectations for Texas going into it. And it is their welcome to the SEC moment. Even if they win, it'll be a, hey, we're going to welcome ourselves to the SEC for the Longhorns. So I do think there's that there. I said earlier, another point I want to talk about, I think this will be the most highly watched game of the season. That's my guess. I think Georgia-Alabama will compete with it. I think Ohio State-Oregon will be up there. I don't know if they'll compete with it. Obviously, Ohio State-Michigan is going to compete with it. Expect those few games to be up there for the highest, but this one has potential to be the very highest viewed game. I don't think that that's out of the question at all. And then the last thing, these are 2 playoff contenders, and we're in a new world now where there's going to be 12 teams, and there are going to be more instances of a playoff matchup being a repeat matchup from earlier on in the season. And this is also a world where Georgia and Texas could play 3 times this season. They play in the regular season. This could totally end up being the SEC matchup. This game matters for seeding. It's not just, Georgia lost to Texas. Texas lost to Georgia. They'll be okay. They'll make the playoff. The answer to that is probably yes, but this is going to matter for, are you going to be in the SEC championship? Every game matters still. This notion that, you're still fine if you lose the games is only partially true. It's true, yes, you're still fine. It's not terminal if you lose 2 games. You can still make the college football playoff and win the national championship, but it makes the road more difficult. So this game will matter. It will matter for getting into the SEC championship. It will matter for seeding in the playoff, and it will be a matchup that potentially could be repeated in December or January, right? It's people's guess for the SEC championship matchup, and if they had already played once, hard to beat a really, really good team twice. It just doesn't happen very often. You don't even get to see it happen very often because repeat matchups don't happen that much. But I do think that this is a possible 2 to 3 times we could see this game, and this will just be the first showdown, and it'll give us the first idea of how these teams really stack up against each other. Other minor storylines, Isaiah Bond was the most effective wide receiver against Georgia last year. I don't care if you could look up numbers and see that a different wide receiver was better. Luther Burden was very good against Georgia. Isaiah Bond, in big moments in a game that Georgia lost, showed up, right? And so he was effective. He will be a guy that's familiar with Georgia's secondary and has a quarterback that's better at throwing the football this time around, right? Now, I don't know that Texas will have the line that Alabama had, and obviously I'm a little tiny bit lower on Texas than the general public is, but I still think it's going to be an effective offense. It's the defense I'm a little bit more worried about. They lost some of their key pieces. They add a couple of them. Overall, a pretty good unit. I don't know if it's as good as Georgia's. So you get little minor storylines in this too, but huge game, maybe bigger than people are even saying. Thanks for watching. Link is down below for that newsletter.